Hello, everyone. Welcome to Scary Storytelling today. I have an interesting story to share with you. In the early days of autumn, the morning light filtered through the sheer curtains like delicate flakes of gold, casting a soft glow over the bedroom. Standing in front of the mirror, Grace Jo carefully applied a touch of lip gloss, her delicate fingers gliding over her lips with practiced precision. The reflection staring back at her was as flawless as porcelain, smooth, radiant skin and eyes that carried a quiet, lingering allure. Though she had stepped into her 30s, time had done little to erase the youthful charm from her face. Putting on makeup again, a rough voice broke the silence from outside the door. It was her father-in-law, George Lee. "You're already married. Do you really need to dress up like this every day? It's improper for a married woman to be so flashy." Grace's hand froze mid-stroke, and a faint, bitter smile tugged at the corners of her lips. Ever since she had married into the Lee family, George's constant criticism had been as relentless as spring rain never ending, always finding something to nitpick. If she wore bright colors, she was accused of being too frivolous. If she laughed too freely, she was labeled as improper. Even the way she walked could somehow provoke his disapproval. The Lee family was well off in town, running a moderately successful construction supply business. Her husband, Eric Lee, had inherited the company and was constantly caught up in the demands of running it. His days were a blur of phone calls, negotiations, and logistics, leaving him with little time for anything or anyone else. In the 3 years they had been married, Grace had slowly grown accustomed to the loneliness that came with it. At first, George had pretended to approve of his son's choice in a wife, but as time passed, his resentment toward his beautiful daughter-in-law only deepened. Every time he saw her step out of the house, dressed with care, a frown would crease his forehead, as though it were the most offensive sight in the world. "Heading out this late?" George's voice carried from the wicker chair where he sat in the courtyard, his sharp gaze locking onto Grace as she stepped toward the gate. "Just going to the store," she answered, keeping her head slightly lowered, avoiding his scrutinizing stare. She quickened her pace, though she could still feel his eyes on her, like a blade poised to carve through the secrets she kept hidden deep inside. Eric, caught up in the whirlwind of his business, seemed blissfully unaware of the quiet tension brewing between his wife and father. He left early and returned late, collapsing into bed without so much as noticing when Grace bought new clothes, let alone sensing the unease that filled their home. That night, long after the house had gone silent, Grace lay awake in bed, her thoughts tangled in knots. The dim glow of her phone screen illuminated her pale face as she scrolled through her messages, her fingers moving quickly to delete them one by one. Then, as if trying to erase something even deeper, she shoved her phone beneath her pillow and shut her eyes. Outside, the waning moon hung in the sky like a silver scythe, slicing through the illusion of peace that cloaked this household. Lately, George had been waking in the middle of the night, restless. He would pace the courtyard in slow, deliberate steps, his sharp eyes catching glimpses of flickering light from his daughter-in-law's room. He had seen her standing by the window late at night, unmoving, lost in thought. Those fragmented images pieced themselves together in his mind, forming a picture he couldn't ignore, an uneasy suspicion gnawing at his gut. This marriage, he thought grimly, was like a rope fraying bit by bit, unraveling toward an unknown abyss. It was a rainy afternoon, the kind where fine, misty drizzle blurred the world into a muted haze. Bored and seeking an escape from her stifling routine, Grace wandered into a newly opened cafe beside the construction supply store. She just wanted a quiet moment to herself, a small reprieve from the life that felt increasingly foreign to her. She never expected that this ordinary afternoon would mark a turning point in her life. The cafe was cozy, its atmosphere warm and inviting. In a quiet corner, a young man sat alone, immersed in a book. When he finally looked up, their eyes met in an unplanned moment of connection. His gaze was clear, untouched by the sharpness of ambition or the weight of calculation, a stark contrast to Eric's shrewd businessman persona. "I'm Ethan Chen," he said, nodding slightly in greeting. Grace hesitated, instinctively avoiding the stranger's eyes, but as the waiter approached, she realized the only available seat in the entire cafe was the one across from him, and so, over the course of a single cup of coffee, two lonely souls found themselves sharing something unspoken, a quiet understanding of solitude, a longing for something more. Ethan had just graduated as an architectural designer. There was a youthful energy to the way he spoke, his words carrying an effortless enthusiasm that stirred something long buried in Grace. Sitting across from him, she felt, for the first time in years, as if she were breathing in fresh air. Meanwhile, George had grown more watchful in recent weeks. Between the store and home, he noticed every little change: how often his daughter-in-law left the house alone, the way she returned with an unfamiliar glow in her cheeks. It reminded him of something he had seen before, something he had learned to recognize in women who had begun to drift away from their marriages, and he didn't like it one bit. Night fell like a vast, inky curtain, draping over the city. Grace Zhou stood hesitantly at the entrance of the cafe, torn between reason and impulse. Ethan Chen, sensing her hesitation, spoke softly. "I know a place where you can see the whole city lit up at night." The observation deck was deserted, silent except for the whisper of the wind. Below them, the city's lights shimmered like scattered stars, casting a glow over their faces. In that moment, Grace felt something she hadn't felt in years, a quickened heartbeat, a flutter deep in her chest. She knew she was edging dangerously close to a precipice, yet she found herself unable to turn back. Meanwhile, George Lee's suspicions had grown unbearable. Unable to shake his unease, he began secretly following his daughter-in-law. He saw it all: her slipping into the cafe, the way she leaned toward the young man, the stolen glances, the quiet laughter. Each scene cut into him like a blade, slicing through his pride, his sense of control. This wasn't just about his son's marriage. To George, this was about the dignity of the Lee family, the weight of their name. Grace and Ethan's relationship was like a tightrope walk over an abyss, reckless, exhilarating, and impossibly fragile. What began as an innocent encounter had evolved into a secret that consumed them both. Their messages became more frequent, their meetings more deliberate, their caution growing with each passing day. They moved like ghosts through the city, stealing whatever moments they could, knowing that their borrowed time would eventually run out. Late at night, Grace curled up under her blanket, her fingers flying over her phone screen, typing out a message to Ethan. The glow from the screen illuminated her anxious expression. Beyond her window, George stood in the shadows of the courtyard, barely visible beneath the pale moonlight. In his weathered hands, he gripped an old cell phone, meticulously noting down every detail. This wasn't just a suspicion anymore. It was a hunt, and soon the storm would break. The city lights flickered to life as dusk deepened, neon signs blinking like a constellation of artificial stars. Grace stood by the window of a hotel room, staring down at the busy streets below, watching the ebb and flow of strangers moving through their own routines. unaware of the turmoil brewing above them. Behind her, Ethan was unpacking a small bag of fruit he had bought earlier. "You were right," Grace murmured absent-mindedly, deleting her recent call history. "We should be more careful," but she had no idea that outside, in the shadows of a nearby taxi, George was watching. His hands trembled slightly, his nails pressing into his palms. After weeks of silent pursuit, after countless nights spent piecing together the puzzle, he had finally cornered his prey, his daughter-in-law, and the man she was betraying his son with, inside the hotel room. Grace leaned into Ethan's embrace, inhaling the fresh, youthful scent of his cologne. It was so different from the stale familiarity of her husband's presence. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to forget her marriage, forget her fears, forget the price of what she was doing then. A loud, urgent knock shattered the moment. Bang, bang, bang. "Is anyone inside?" "Housekeeping." A gravelly, aged voice filtered through the door. Grace exhaled in relief, nodding at Ethan to answer. The door creaked open, and then she saw him. George stood in the doorway, his face carved from stone, his expression unreadable but utterly terrifying. In his hand, a phone's flash flickered rapidly. Click, a single photograph, a moment frozen in time. Grace felt her knees go weak, her breath catching in her throat. Ethan panicked. He grabbed his coat, instinctively stepping back as if he could flee the scene, but George moved faster, snatching his arm in an iron grip. "Well, well." George's voice was eerily calm, laced with an unsettling chill. "You two certainly have been keeping yourselves entertained." Grace dropped to her knees with a sharp thud, desperation clouding her features. "Dad, please, please don't tell Eric. I made a mistake. I swear it'll never happen again." George let out a low, humorless chuckle, holding up his phone. "And now you're afraid? What do you think Eric will do when he sees these?" Ethan, seizing the moment, wrenched free and bolted down the hallway. George didn't chase him. His eyes remained locked onto his daughter-in-law, sharp as daggers. Grace's voice broke. "I'll do anything. Just please don't tell him." George stepped toward the window, his gaze fixed on the traffic below. He was silent for a long time before he finally spoke. "You want me to keep this secret?" His voice was almost thoughtful. "Fine, but on one condition. I want you to leave my son." George's words landed like a thunderclap, reverberating through the room. Grace stared at him in stunned disbelief. She had braced herself for threats, humiliation, maybe even blackmail. But this, no, she whispered, shaking her head instinctively. "I can't leave Eric." George's expression turned to ice. "Do you really think you deserve to be his wife after this?" He stepped closer, lowering his voice to a dangerous whisper. "You have 3 days. Either you file for divorce, or I show these pictures to Eric and the rest of the world." The ride home felt suffocating, the weight of her decision pressing against her ribs. Streetlights stretched her shadow long and thin on the pavement, but no matter how far it reached, it could not illuminate the darkness inside her. That night, George made a call. "Eric," his voice was steady, composed. "Come home, we need to talk." The next morning, Grace sensed the shift immediately. Eric was different. He no longer buried himself in work. Instead, he stood at the store's entrance, staring out at the street, his expression distant, detached. He watched her with unfamiliar eyes, colder than she had ever seen. One evening, his voice cut through the silence unexpectedly. "You've been acting strange lately." Grace's hand jerked, spilling tea onto the table. She forced a smile. "I'm just tired. That's all." Eric didn't push further. He only sighed a long, weary sound and walked upstairs. His retreating figure looked impossibly heavy, as though something had broken inside him. The deadline loomed. That night, Grace stood before the mirror, staring at her own reflection. She looked hollow, defeated. At dinner, she finally spoke the words that tasted like poison on her tongue. "Eric, let's get a divorce." The room went still. Eric set down his chopsticks with unsettling calm. His gaze met hers, steady and unreadable. "Why? We're not right for each other," she murmured, unable to meet his eyes. "You deserve better." A flicker of something unreadable crossed his face. "All right." One word. That was all he said. Then he rose from the table and walked away, his footsteps echoing up the stairs, slow and deliberate. George sat back in his chair, watching the scene unfold exactly as he had planned. A small, satisfied smile ghosted over his lips. Grace sat frozen, her tears falling soundlessly. She had no idea that this was only the beginning, that the truth lurking beneath this divorce was far more twisted than she ever could have imagined. With only a day left before the divorce was finalized, Grace sat alone in the bedroom, scrolling through old pictures of her and Ethan. She had orchestrated every move so carefully, yet she had never expected to be caught. From downstairs, voices carried up the staircase. "Eric, has she been acting strange?" George's voice was low and deliberate. Eric hesitated. "Why? Did you find something?" Grace felt her breath hitch. "You should look into her past," George said. "There are things about her you don't know." Eric made a call later that night. A private investigator. Deep in the silence of the night, George stood alone in the courtyard, his gaze fixed on Grace's darkened window. Slowly, he reached into his pocket, pulling out an old, yellowed photograph. The woman in the picture looked almost identical to Grace. A cold glint flashed in George's eyes. The next morning, Grace Jo woke up to find her wallet missing. Panic surged through her as she turned the room inside out, searching every possible corner. Yet it was nowhere to be found. But in George Lee's study, she stumbled upon something far more shocking, a newspaper clipping from 20 years ago. And right there, printed in black and white, was a photograph of her aunt. At that moment, everything clicked into place. She finally understood why her father-in-law had forced her to divorce, her carefully laid plan for revenge meticulously designed. Years in the making had been exposed before she even had a chance to fully execute it. Meanwhile, Eric Lee sat in his car, gripping his phone so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The private investigator's report lay open on his lap, each word a blow that left him struggling to breathe. His marriage, the one he had believed in, trusted, had been nothing but a carefully orchestrated deception from the very start. That night, 3 people sat in silence under the same roof, each lost in their own thoughts. Grace paced anxiously in her room. Eric remained frozen in his car, his mind replaying everything he had just read, and George sat in his wicker chair, his expression calm as he waited for the inevitable confrontation. The affair had been a spectacle, a scandal, but the truth behind it was something far more twisted. On the day of the divorce, the sunlight was blinding. As if determined to expose every hidden secret, Grace stood. "You do realize," a familiar voice murmured behind her, low and steady, "that this was always part of my plan." She turned slowly. George stood there, an aged envelope in his hands. He pulled out a faded photograph, holding it up for her to see. The woman in the picture looked eerily familiar, 7 parts Grace, but from another time, another era. "She was your aunt, wasn't she?" George's voice held a sharp edge of amusement. 20 years ago, She used the same tricks, seduced my son, stole from our family, and now here you are. Trying to repeat history, Grace's blood ran cold. Her lips parted, but no words came. She had underestimated him. All this time, she thought she had been the one playing the game, setting the traps, pulling the strings, but she was wrong. Her aunt had once been a daughter-in-law of the Lee family too. She had married Eric's older brother, only to vanish one day, taking a small fortune with her. The betrayal had shattered him, left him broken beyond repair until he finally wasted away under the weight of it. For 2 decades, George had carried the wound of that loss, never stopping his quiet search for the woman who had destroyed his firstborn. And then, one day, Grace had walked through his front door, thinking she had fooled them all. "You really thought I wouldn't recognize you?" George laughed, the sound cold and cutting. "No matter how much makeup you put on, you can't hide where you come from. It's in your bones." Her face drained of color. She had left behind every clue, every breadcrumb, believing she was the one setting the bait. The texts, the affair, the scandal, every move was meant to drag the Lee family into disgrace. But she had been outmaneuvered from the start. How? Her voice trembled. "Finding out who you really were wasn't difficult," George said, pulling a thick folder from his pocket. "I had you investigated for 6 months. These documents alone could put you behind bars." At that moment, Eric emerged from the courthouse, the divorce papers in hand. In his other hand, another document, a report. Her report. "Let her go, Dad," Eric said, his voice weary, drained of all emotion. "Let it end here." Grace stared at him, her heart pounding. He had known all along. The distance, the coldness, it hadn't been uncertainty or suspicion. He had been watching her fall right into her own trap. In the end, it was Grace who turned and walked away first. Her revenge had failed, but in doing so, it had brought an unexpected resolution, an end to a family's generational feud. As George watched her disappear down the street, for the first time in years, he felt something shift inside him. Relief. Some grudges were never meant to be passed down. Some cycles needed to be broken. And perhaps, in the act of letting go, true freedom was finally found.